Ed Robertson, welcoming you to this week's edition of TV Confidential, radio talk show about television that will bring you something old and something new this week. Our second hour will include an encore presentation of our conversation from January 2020 with Linda Day George. Linda Day George, star of Mission Impossible, Chisholm, The Silent Force, many of the shows produced by Quinn Martin, and an actress who most of you also will remember for her many appearances with her husband at the time, Christopher George. We'll replay our conversation with Linda Day George in our second hour. We hope you stay tuned for that. Coming up later on this hour, we will bring you part two of a conversation that began a few weeks ago with Steve Randisi. Steve Randisi, author of Penny Singleton, a biography. Penny Singleton, of course, first actress to play Blondie on screen. We'll talk about how Penny nearly got fired from the very first Blondie picture she made after she had stood up to then Columbia Pictures president Harry Cohn. We'll also talk about her longtime connection with Rod Serling, including her appearance in 1964, one of the very last episodes of The Twilight Zone. Steve Randisi will join us. We'll talk some more about Penny Singleton later on in this hour. In the meantime, we'll begin our first hour by welcoming entertainment journalist, author, and comedy historian Tripp Whetsell. Tripp's latest book, Norman Lear, His Life and Times, is the first comprehensive biography of the legendary Emmy Award-winning writer, producer, director, the man behind All in the Family, Maude, the Jeffersons, One Day at a Time, Good Times, many, many shows that had something to say when they were originally on and still have something to say today and still reach new audiences more than 50 years later. Norman Lear, the man most people would agree changed network television forever in 1971 with the premiere of All in the Family, although I understand, and this is something I learned in reading Tripp's book, that Lear himself was a little dodgy about whether he actually changed television or not. He said different things in different interviews. That's one of the things that fascinates me about Tripp. So we'll get into that in just a second. Much has been written about Norman Lear before and after his death on December 5th, 2023. However, Tripp argues that there remains a lot to learn about the legendary man in the white hat, particularly since Norman Lear himself was often reluctant to discuss his early life in great detail. Tripp talks about that and more in Norman Lear, His Life and Times. We'll tell you where you can find the book in just a second. Tripp Whetsell, welcome to TV Confidential.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, Ed.
There are two takeaways I got from the book. I'll start with those, and then we'll open up the conversation from there. In a lot of ways, Norman Lear is not unlike Rod Serling in that even though he lived 50 years longer than Rod Serling, in a lot of ways, Norman Lear, at least I feel this way, is one of those figures that we think of in ideal form. We think of him as larger than life, maybe not beatific, but we think of him in terms of the legend. You attempt to show the whole person, warts and all, and what particularly interests me is that you do a good job of showing the flamboyant Norman Lear, the salesman Norman Lear, early in his career, the one that helped him get his footing in show business, and that seems to have been forgotten behind the social activist Norman Lear that most of us think of today.
Yes, well, that's very true. I mean, he was a definitely larger-than-life figure, and of course, what sort of lit the fuse for him in show business was that he was a comedy writer in the early days of live television. He paired up with Ed Simmons, who went on, of course, to become the head writer and producer of the Carol Burnett Show, which ran on CBS on Saturday night, same night that All in the Family did, or what was known as the greatest night in television, in the 1970s. And Norman had an idea for Danny Thomas, who was the hottest nightclub comedian at the time, to do a routine about words in the Yiddish language that had no other counterpart in English or anything else. And he managed to finagle his way in to get it with a meeting with Danny Thomas by pretending to be a New York Times reporter who was on deadline. And he called up the William Morris office, got the name out of Variety, called up the William Morris office and said, I've just written a profile of Mr. Danny Thomas, and I'm on the way back to New York. I have to. My plane's about to take off. I have to ask a few questions. Can I get his phone number? And he timed it. He didn't call. He didn't actually talk to the agent. He didn't talk to the agent's secretary. And the secretary gave him the number. Danny was so impressed by his audacious that he said, what do you got for me, kid? And he said, well, it would read well. And it was a short bit. And as it turned out that Danny was looking for a piece to do. He was doing a benefit for the Friars Club that night at Ciro's, the very famous nightclub in L.A., and he wanted to he needed a bit that night. And the bit went over so well that it lit the fuse. In the audience that night was Norman's cousin, David Susskind, the famous talk show host, who at the time was a packager for MCA. Neither one of them knew that Norman was in Hollywood at the time, but they got wind that Norman had written the show for Danny, written this great bit for Danny Thomas, and David Susskind at the time was scouting talent, packaging talent for the Ford Star Review with Jack Haley, which was a new NBC variety show. And on the basis of that bit that he sold to Danny Thomas, that's what started his career as a comedy writer. He got him on the road as a comedy writer in the early days of live television.
And without realizing, Tripp, you just set up my next question, which is the other big takeaway I have for the book is not only is this a cradle-to-grave look at the life and career and the accomplishments and the legacy of Norman Lear, but in many cases, you do a good job of painting the picture, the stories, the backstory of the various key figures that Norman Lear worked with or crossed paths with one way or another, particularly in the first 20 years of his career before All in the Family made him a superstar. I mean, in fact, it's very difficult to write a book. It's difficult to write a book anyway. It's
You're kidding me. I had no idea about that.
Well, no, as you know, I speak from experience. But
I know you do. Of course you do.
But it's even harder to write a book where you've got more than one narrative going on. And while your main narrative is the life and career and legacy of Norman Lear, there are times when Norman kind of steps in the background, so to speak, and becomes a supporting character in his own book, because that is when you give the reader an idea of why it was a big deal for him to write for Martha Ray at the time. Why it was a big deal for him to write for George Gobel at the time. That sort of thing. And it's the context of all that. And I dare say Lear himself, if he had lived to see this book, and we'll get to that in just a second, if he had lived to see this book, I think he would appreciate the attempt you made and the extent to which you succeeded in laying the context for all of his accomplishments in his life as well.
Well, I would hope so. I would like to think so. I mean, Norman was a personal hero of mine. I teach the only college class in the country on him at Emerson College in Boston, where I'm on the affiliated faculty. And I'm a pop culture historian myself, like you are. I grew up watching your shows. I love, anything having to do with classic television in particular is, old Hollywood, but old television in particular is really my sweet, sweet spot. And so I would hope that he would like this book. I wanted to do it as an affectionate but candid tribute to him, to paint everything for him. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to participate in the book, but he just I think was just sort of at the end of his life and just didn't want to do it. I was not ever clear definitively why, but he did. His team gave me his blessing, and I got the blessing from his daughter Kate early on. Even though she wasn't able to participate either. And he did my class twice at Emerson College, and so I met him several times, and he zoomed my class, and I also interviewed him for the 40th anniversary of All in the Family for TV Guide. So I had several interactions with him, and he was a wonderful guy, as you know. He was just as nice and down to earth as they came, and made you always feel like you were the most important person in the room. He always would say, Ed, it took me a lifetime to get here, and I couldn't be happy. So I would hope he would be happy with the book. Yes.
Tripp Whetsell is on the line with us. Tripp is the author of Norman Lear, His Life and Times, the first comprehensive cradle-to-grave biography of the legendary television producer who, one can argue, was the very first behind-the-scenes television figure to become a bona fide celebrity in his own right. Norman Lear, His Life and Times, available now wherever books are sold. You can also find Norman Lear, His Life and Times, Amazon.com, where books are sold online. For more on Tripp Whetsell, twprcommunications.com, twprcommunications.com. Stay with us, folks. We'll be right back. This portion of TV Confidential is brought to you by PrisonFit. PrisonFit, a new, comprehensive, and integrated approach to exercise, food, and employment that was developed by prisoners, for prisoners, parolees, and anyone else listening to this program who would like to improve their overall health and well-being. You can learn more about PrisonFit by going to prisonfitlife.com. PrisonFit's mission is to create work, programs, and partnerships that will provide both incarcerated inmates and released or paroled individuals with meaningful employment, training, rehabilitation, and reentry opportunities while treating them with dignity and respect. PrisonFit's main program, Introduction to Small Business, not only has graduated more than 500 in-prison students, but has produced a 2-year released graduate recidivism rate of 6.7%. PrisonFit will expand its Introduction to Small Business program on a statewide basis in 2025. And this is where you can help. PrisonFit is conducting a Kickstarter campaign throughout the month of January 2025 to offer the public various fitness publications and products. The proceeds from this campaign will not only complete and launch these publications and products, but will provide the necessary resources for PrisonFit's statewide in-prison Introduction to Small Business course. For more information, go to prisonfitlife.com and click on the Go to Kickstarter button. That's prisonfitlife.com. Click on the Go to Kickstarter button. prisonfitlife.com. Click on the Go to Kickstarter button, or go to kickstarter.com and search for PrisonFit.
Hi, this is Ernest Hart Jr., Marcus from the Jeffersons, and you're listening to TV Confidential. Well, all right.
For our listeners in the greater Southern California area, Tripp Whetsell will be coming to Los Angeles in January, I understand.
Yeah, so January 8th. I'm excited to be doing a signing at Book Soup to do the book, and we will have some fun surprise guests there, and have a great moderator, my good friend Jeff Abraham, who is one of the most foremost comedy historians in Hollywood. It will be moderating, and it's going to be a very fun night, so I hope you can all come.
Yes, and you can follow Tripp, twprcommunications.com. Are you on Facebook? And
I'm on Facebook and all those usual social media channels. You can also look at my website, my book website, which is normanlearbio.com.
normanlearbio.com, normanlearbio.com. That's easier to remember, and dare I say, a little easier to say live. But you mentioned a little bit, even though Lear did not participate formally as you wrote this book, you benefited from the fact that you had direct interactions with them on more than one occasion. So you got a sense of the person behind the legend, and that I'm sure helped you when you're writing. I understand that this book was almost completed when you learned the news of Norman's passing in December of last year.
Yes, it was, just prophetically. So this time a year ago, I was out at my house on Long Island. I live in New York City, but I was out of my home on Long Island, writing, putting the finishing touches on it. I had the book was delayed a little bit because 2 summers ago I fell off my bicycle and shattered my elbow. I was fine. I was wearing a helmet and everything like that, but it delayed me for about 6 weeks. But I was just finishing up the book when I heard the news, and my phone just basically exploded after I got the alert on scene, and everyone calling me because people knew, a lot of people, of course, knew I was writing a book, and I taught the class with Norman and Emerson, but even more so, they were almost like condolence calls to me. And then I was just trying to, figure out how to finish the book, even though most of the heavy lifting had been done. I mean, Norman was one of those larger-than-life mortal figures that you just never think is going to pass away. Even though, of course, you know what's going to happen in the back of your mind, you just never think it's going to happen. And that's kind of what my mindset was. He was immortal to me.
And when you talk about how you got a lot of condolence messages, even though you were not a blood relative of his, people knew how important he was to you. I understand exactly what you went through because I got a lot of the same reaction when Jim Garner died 10 years ago.
Oh, I'm sure, because I knew you knew him well. And I've actually had it with a couple of people. It was the same for me. I was always a huge Lucille Ball fan, and it was the same for me when she passed away in 1989.
Yeah, and I hadn't thought of it like that, Tripp, but in my case, and I'm sure you can speak to this as well, when I thought about all the various people who came into my life because of my direct association with Garner or the fact that I wrote about his two greatest successes on television and how that touched a lot of people, that's when the personal connection really became clearer to me. And in the glimpse you shared of your story a few minutes ago and in the beginning of Norman Lear, His Life and Times, it sounds like that was much your experience as well.
Oh, very much so. And I think, when you are writing a biography, I mean, whether you know the subject or not, they are part of your life. I mean, they are your life for however long you're working on it. And so, and you don't ever really turn it off. I mean, you're sitting there, every day is a new challenge. You've got the computer, or the typewriter, as it were, whatever you write on these days, or, the legal pad if you write in longhand, and, you always start from zero. And, you keep going until you just can't go anymore, until you run out of gas. And then, but you're always in the back of your mind, you never stop thinking about it. And so I think that's very true. When we write a biography, that the subject is our life for however long we're doing it. And it never really leaves our life. I mean, they're always a subject, they're always in your life forever.
Tripp Whetsell is the author of Norman Lear, His Life and Times, available wherever books are sold. Norman Lear, His Life and Times, also available Amazon.com, where books are sold online. If you listen to us in the greater Los Angeles area, you can meet Tripp Whetsell at Book Soup on January 8th. I don't have my calendar in front of me, so I don't know what day January. Actually, I guess it is a Wednesday because I know the 1st is a Wednesday, so therefore the 8th must also be a Wednesday.
Yes.
Math is a beautiful thing. You can meet Tripp Whetsell Wednesday, January 8th at Book Soup. To keep up with Tripp, to learn more about Norman Lear, His Life and Times, normanlearbio.com, normanlearbio.com. You mentioned how Lear was always a little guarded about revealing many aspects of his personal life. Tripp, why do you think that was?
Well, I think, he didn't have an easy personal life. I mean, he had, his father went to prison when he was 9 years old for selling fake securities. And, I think he just, so I think that really had a huge impact on him. He talked about it to an extent in his book, obviously, but I'm sure there was a lot he could have said that he didn't say, he didn't want to say, and he was just always guarded. I think that really had a searing impact on him for the remainder of his life. You heard very little about his first wife, Charlotte, who he married right before he went off to World War II, and his oldest daughter, but very little is known about that. So he just, he was like many famous people, he wanted to keep his personal and private life and from his public image and professional image, life in two separate lanes. And that, that's understandable.
That is very understandable. And in a lot of ways, he channeled the personal tragedies that he overcame early in his life. And in a lot of ways, he channeled that in his characters and in his work on television and all of his other creative stuff.
Oh, exactly. He had what he always used to say was finding the foolishness of the human condition, meaning that you could find humor in anything. And he talks very pointedly, in his book and in several interviews throughout his career, he talked about the moment he discovered this is right after his father had been arrested. His mother was selling furniture. They were living in Chelsea, Massachusetts at the time. And his mother was selling furniture because she just wanted to get the hell out of Dodge, because she was so embarrassed about what Herman had done. And some stranger came up to him, or some relative came up and said, Norman, well, I guess you're the man of the house now. And he found that was so absurd. He's 9 years old.
Yeah.
His dad had just gone off to prison, been arrested, been on the cover of every newspaper in Boston, and it said, you're the man of the house now. And he said that's when he learned that you could find humor in just about anything.
One of the fun things for me, and if you don't know anything about his accomplishments before All the Family folks, I believe you'll enjoy this part, particularly the first half of Norman Lear, His Life and Times by Tripp Whetsell, is learning about his background in variety television, not only during the golden age of television in the early 1950s, but the golden era of variety television throughout the 50s and early 1960s.
Yes, well, I tried to do that. I mean, I like to give as much context as possible, and I think that's just very important.
And in a lot of ways, it was a training ground dealing with some of the diva-like personalities during the era of live television. I imagine that served him well more than 20 years later in the 1970s when he became a producer in his own right and dealt with strong personalities such as Carol O'Connor. We'll pick up that thread on the other side of the break. In the meantime, our guest this hour is Tripp Whetsell. Tripp is the author of Norman Lear, His Life and Times. Take a quick time out. We'll talk some more. Tripp, we come back here on TV Confidential.
This portion of TV Confidential is brought to us by our friends at Front Porch Realty, the community of realtors in the Northern Bay area of California that is committed to finding the solution that is best for their clients. Whether you're a first-time home buyer or looking to sell or lease your property in Northern California, call Karen Strain at 415-886-7411 or visit frontporchrealtygroup.com for more information on how they can help you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for listening to the TV Confidential podcast. If you like what you hear, please consider subscribing to the TV Confidential podcast, or better yet, give us a review on Apple Podcasts, Podchaser, or wherever you listen to our podcast.